Hopefully we have some slides. Pop up. All right, Beth.
Okay. I'm so excited I took the remote thing. I'm totally in control.
Well, I wanted to start, so we're going to talk about elections very quickly, but I wanted to start with this, our new logo.
This is Indian Country Today.
I don't know if anyone recognized the voice. No? Do it again. No, I won't do it again. There we go.
This is Indian Country Today.
Deb Halen?
We sent a note to Buffy St. Marie that she'd love to do this. And so Buffy St. Marie will be our voice. And you know how James Earl Jones is this is CNN?
Yes.
Well, we got that trouble. I want to start with just setting the scene. Last year was a record year at the polls for Indian Country. At one point, we had more than 100 candidates running across the country, from everything from state legislature to Congress. And so let me start with some really big news from today. As many of you know, last night, Canada had its national elections. And the extraordinary thing was that Jody Wilson-Raybould, who was the Attorney General, was kicked out of the cabinet and then kicked out of the party. And yesterday she ran as an independent candidate and won her seat by a pretty wide margin, 36% to 26% for the Conservative to 22% for the Liberal Party. So she trounced the folks from Trudeau's government. I think this really shows that in the end, so many of the candidates we write about and look about are really independent. And it's the idea that their first allegiance, their first priority is tribal nations. And Jody Wilson-Raybould is a great example of that. It'll be really interesting to see as the next government of Canada starts to put together a coalition in order to govern how they will reach out both to tribal nations and particularly to Jody Wilson-Raybould, the Member of Parliament for Vancouver. Politics is about numbers, so let's play with a few. In this last election, as many of you know, we completely doubled the number in Congress. Right now, if you look at three numbers, I want to throw out 1.7%, 0.74%, and 0.948, and we can go on from that. Those are really important numbers. The first one is if you look at just the straight percentage of voting population from Indian Country. That really should be the threshold. That should be where we get to in terms of all elective offices across the board. The second number is with our doubling in Congress, we are now up to 0.74%, about, I have bad math there, 0.75% last year's slide. The other one that I think is really extraordinary is 9.48, which is the percentage of Native Americans in state legislatures. So when we look at the success we've had in Congress with Representatives Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids and Representatives Cole and Mullen, it shows a great strength, but we're doing much better in state legislatures than we are in Congress by a factor of 2. The population is 5.2 million, 1.7%. States with the highest percentage, and this should be where the targets are. This is where we should try to elect the most people. Certainly Alaska at almost 20%, Oklahoma and New Mexico would be at the top of that list. 4 Native Americans in the House, currently none in the Senate. It was just mentioned about the delegate. There are several tribes that have delegates to Congress in their treaties, and now I'm ahead of myself again. It's really interesting to see how the rest of the world does this. If you look at other places where they have set delegates for indigenous population, what tends to happen is in the first round, someone will win a seat as a designated a delegate to either the Parliament or to the Congress. And then over time, that person then helps someone else get elected. And so in New Zealand, for example, you have a higher percentage in the Parliament than you do in the general population. And it's because of that dual representative structure that's something that the delegate thing would work in this country. If proportional representation was the goal of the House beyond the treaty rights, proportional representation would mean at least 7 delegates to the Congress from Indian country. Right now, we have one of the rare events, and that's a special election. And Wisconsin 7th is really critical. It's the first special election, and it could actually mean in this Congress that there could be 3 Native American women elected. They just set the primary date. It's going to be in February, and the general election for this special election will be in May. So this is all before the general election. It's likely that the 4 candidates or 4 members of Congress will run for re-election. So we could start with 4, and we have across the country now 10 congressional candidates. Many of them are here in New Mexico, and you can see that list. We'll be publishing spreadsheets throughout the year of where candidates are running. Like I've mentioned, 2 years ago, we were at over 100 for state legislatures. And we now have about 20, but we're really in the season where people are just starting to declare, so the spreadsheets aren't very full yet. But we should have that shortly. One of the things in the special election I want to mention is that when you look at, and I mentioned this as a math problem, but so Native Americans tend to vote in presidential election years in higher numbers than during non-presidential election years. And of course, that's a good thing. But the funny thing is, if you look at where the most impact could be, it would be in smaller elections, such as special elections. Here's where the math plays in. So in Wisconsin 7th, for example, tribal citizens are about 2% of the district. But in this case, 2% could be really a big number. And this goes back to the idea that in special elections, there's a really low turnout. In the last general election, 400,000 people voted in that district. A special election will likely be half of that. The last Democratic primary was won with 27,000 votes. And remember, that will likely shrink in a special election. So the odds of being able to impact the outcome are much higher in a special election than they are in a general election. So I just want to make a couple of key points. You got to run to win. If you know people that are interested in running, this is the time to weigh in. So many times, particularly in the last cycle, there were races that should not have been won. If you just look at it from an election grid, Representative Sharice Davids should not be in Congress. It made no sense on paper, but she ran. And once you make that step of actually getting out and running, it changes the percentage of who's going to get in. And you got to run to win. Probably the most important thing for the state legislatures right now is whoever's elected in this cycle will begin the process of redistricting. In some cases, that will be actually by the legislatures. In other cases, it will be appointing districting commissions. And that probably is the most important future event to looking at how you're going to set the next Congress. Montana started this really many decades ago, and Montana is one of the states with a higher percentage in the state legislature than, or at least equal to the general population, with 14 members of the legislature. I guess my takeaway from all of this is what happens after a record year in election? Another record year. You build on that, you see what works, and you experiment, and you find new ways to do it. And of course, we'll be covering it all, so thank you very much.